This is lecture number 17 for Tuesday, May 19th, for the French Revolution class at Northland College. So I talked last time about the Directory and the fact the Directory was it was a republic in form, but it had such a narrow franchise that it had enemies on both sides of the spectrum. That the monarchists didn't like it because it was a republic, and the sans-culottes and the lower classes didn't like it because they didn't get to vote in it. And so the Directory, for its 4 or 5 years of existence, 4 years, was essentially buffeted by attacks by the left to make it a more radical republic, a more egalitarian republic, and they were attacked by the right who wanted a monarchy. Well, in the summer of 1799, the situation got worse for France. I mentioned the Directory really relied on the army, both to put down massive popular demonstrations, but also because as long as the army kept winning, it gave prestige to the Directory, and it caused people to be more loyal to the Directory. Well, in the summer of 1799, a number of things happened. First of all, there was an election that brought the left into power, and so the left took over. And what's actually interesting here is that this new government installed a minister of police named Joseph Fouché. Fouché is the same guy who was a terrorist. He had done the mitraillades. He had been the one who tried to abolish Christianity and introduce the cult of reason and the cult of Brutus, and he had led the de-Christianization movement. Fouché had blood all over his hands from the revolution, but he's now the minister of police, and he is faced almost immediately with a monarchist revolt in the south of France, which threatens the Directory government. But then also at the same time, Napoleon is off in Egypt, and Austria had gotten their clocks cleaned by Napoleon in Italy, ending in 1797. But now Austria goes to war again, and they start marching into Italy, and there's no Napoleon this time, and so they start pushing the French right back out of Italy, and they take control of Italy. And so the Directory begins to, it's got both it's got the left sort of in power, it's got these massive revolts by the right, and it's losing prestige because it's not winning the war. So this was an opportunity. Nobody had liked the Directory for a long time, but it had always had just enough strength and resilience to survive. Well, at this point, a number of people decided that the Directory just wasn't a good form of government. They wanted it to go away. And in particular, Abbé Sieyès emerges again. Now, I mentioned him last time. He was one of the prime intellectual movers in turning the Third Estate into the National Assembly back in 1789. He had really pushed through the National Assembly asserting itself in summer 1789. He had written the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, and he had been around for most of the subsequent revolution. He had sort of taken a back seat. He was in the Constitutional Convention, but he had not been a major player in that. He'd been there through the whole terror, hadn't really supported it. But he now decided after 5 years of the Directory that the Directory was really an awkward government structure, and in particular, he felt that he really wanted a better legislature. Sieyès was really concerned about the legislature, and he wanted a stronger legislature. He starts looking around for people to help him overthrow the Directory. Now, Fouché actually got thrown out as Minister of Police in the fall, so he was looking for work. So Sieyès finds Fouché and says, hey, you want to help? And Fouché was like, sure, I'm totally on board. Talleyrand was a former priest who had become a revolutionary, and he's on board. Ducos was on board also. He's a member of the Directory. And then Bonaparte. Now, Lucien Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte's brother, was in the Council of 500 and was the president of the Council of 500. Napoleon Bonaparte is a general. He comes back from Egypt, of course, and so both Bonapartes are in on the coup. Okay, and so they decide that they're going to stage this coup, and what they're going to do is basically use Napoleon Bonaparte's military muscle to force the Council of 500 and the Council of Elders, the legislature, to essentially call for a new constitution, and then Sieyès and Bonaparte and et cetera are going to write that constitution and give themselves jobs. So they're basically going to stage a coup by forcing the government at gunpoint to accept a new constitution. So it goes like this. Lucien Bonaparte, who is the president of the Council of 500, convinces the legislature to move to Saint-Cloud, which is a suburb of Paris to the west of Paris. Not nearly as far as Versailles, but outside of Paris. And he did that in large part because he wanted to, he didn't want the sans-culottes or the people of Paris to be involved in this at all, and he wanted to isolate the legislature so that he could push them around better. But his ostensible justification for this was to protect the legislature from the people of Paris, the sans-culottes, etc. Then he gets Napoleon Bonaparte, his brother, this is Lucien Bonaparte, gets Napoleon named as the head of all the military forces in Paris. Okay, and so then on 17 Brumaire, which is actually November 8th, 1799, Abbé Sieyès, who is a director at this point, he's on the directory. Remember, the directory is 5 people at this time. He convinces them all to resign at once. And this would mean that the Council of Elders is supposed to appoint a new directory to replace all those people. But then, on the, I'm sorry, not the Council of Elders, the Council of 500. But then the next day, Lucien Bonaparte stands up before the Council of Elders and says, my brother wants to say something. And so Napoleon comes in, and Napoleon basically says that he's demanding that they change the Constitution. And Napoleon basically says, I've got soldiers out there. Well, the legislature actually, the Council of 500 tries to physically kill Napoleon on the spot. They try to attack him. And Lucien Bonaparte very cleverly, quick thinkingly pushes his brother out the door and then sends in the troops. And basically the Council of 500 is then confronted with, they're at gunpoint being told that they're going to do a new constitution. And then so essentially what happens then is the legislature at gunpoint agrees to appoint 3 consuls. And the word consul is from an old Roman position. They're going to appoint 3 consuls to run the government temporarily while the legislature adjourns for 6 weeks to write a new constitution. Right? And so officially the legislature has decided to write a new constitution, has appointed a temporary government of consuls, and is going to come back with a new constitution. But everybody knows that what's happened is that the Bonapartes, Napoleon and Lucien, have basically forced the legislature to adjourn for 6 weeks while they're going to write a new constitution. So over the next 6 weeks, Sieyès and Napoleon basically negotiate, they write the new constitution, and it's kind of a negotiation because Napoleon really wants a strong executive. He wants to have a single person or a small number of people in charge who can make lots of decisions quickly and really make the government work well. He doesn't like lots of debate and negotiation and all that. Sieyès, on the other hand, wants a strong legislature. And in particular, Sieyès felt that during the Terror, the legislature had sort of been dominated by a few people, and he wanted power in the legislature, but he wanted power controlled in the legislature so that no individuals would really control too much power. And he was trying to prevent a legislature that could do what the convention done, to sort of pass all these laws that dramatically changed the legal system on the spur of the moment, etc. So Sieyès is really concerned about the legislature, Napoleon's really concerned about the executive, and they negotiate it. And what really happens here is that Sieyès has this image, he's got these ideas about the legislature, and he thinks he's really concerned about making sure that nobody in the legislature, that the legislature itself can't be too capricious, can't go flying off in one direction, another direction. He wants to have a bunch of checks and balances within the legislature. But what he doesn't realize is that Napoleon sees from the outside that he's trying to set up a system whereby the legislature on paper has all this power, etc., but that the executive branch can just do an end run around the legislature. And that's essentially what happens, is that Napoleon manages to get CS to agree to a system where the legislature looks great on paper and it looks like it'll really rein in anybody having too much power. But in fact, it's a system that allows the council to hack the system and basically ignore the legislature. So anyway, all this gets produced in the Constitution of the year 8, which is 1800. And under the new Constitution, you have the executive is 3 consuls. There are 3 consuls, but one of them is called the first consul, and the other 2 are just consuls. And the first consul really has the majority of the power of the government, the executive. So there's really a single person who's given executive power. Then, there's a multi-tiered system of elections for the legislature. And essentially this is like, the Constitution of the year 3 on steroids, that basically there's all sorts of wealth requirements and tax requirements for voting and then for holding office. And essentially at the national level, meaning people who can actually hold a position at in the national government, there's only 6,000 people who are wealthy enough to actually qualify for this in all of France, right? And so basically they've just said that the only people in the national government are going to be the wealthy elites. But it's going to be there's an election. I mean, there are elections, and then there's this legislature, and the legislature is really strange. There are 4 different houses in the legislature. I mean, the United States is 2 houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. There are 4 in this Constitution. The first is called the Council of State, and the Council of State is the members of the Council of State are selected by the Council. Okay, so the executive picks the legislators for this, and the Council of State just writes laws. That's all they do. They don't vote on laws. They don't pass laws. They don't debate laws. They just write laws. Okay. Then then there's another house called the Tribunate, which is elected, and the Tribunate debates and discusses the legislation. They sort of poke holes in it, and they try to come up with arguments for and against it, etc., and they debate it thoroughly. And then there's a third body called the Legislative Body, which votes on legislation. They don't debate it, they don't discuss it, they listen to all the debates, they understand all the debates that happened in the Tribunate, and then they vote on it, okay? And then there's a fourth body called the Senate, and again, the senators are selected by the consul. And the Senate doesn't actually make legislation, doesn't vote on legislation, etc., but it does have a veto power. It can basically say that this legislation is unconstitutional, it's out of here. So they basically just have a veto of legislation. So legislation gets written by the Council of State, gets debated in the Tribunate, gets voted on in the legislative body, and then gets vetoed or not vetoed, stamp of approval or a veto from the Senate. And the first and last of those, the Council of State and the Senate, the members are appointed by the consul. Consul, not council. And this looks good on paper, but in fact, the fact that the consul is able to appoint members to the Council of State and to the Senate means that he can essentially do whatever he wants with legislation. All right, and we'll see how that happens. And because basically what Napoleon does then is, first of all, he packs both the Council of State, the lowest level, with people he likes, and he packs the Senate with people he likes. And then basically, and eventually he actually even pushes CS out of power and puts him in the Senate. And so essentially what happens is the Council of State is full of people that Napoleon appointed, and so he can pack it with people who will write the laws that he likes. But then he basically, he can just intimidate the other two, and he just sort of ignores the other two. And then the Senate actually, there's written in one tiny little detail in the Constitution. The Senate, it's supposed to just sort of veto or not laws. It's supposed to just say it's constitutional, it's unconstitutional, kind of like the U.S. Supreme Court. It doesn't write laws and vote on laws, but it can say that's unconstitutional. Well, the Senate, that's its job. But there's one little clause written in the Constitution that the Senate can pass an occasional special law called a senatus consulta, which is a sort of a Senate opinion on what the law should be, and that can actually become the law temporarily. Well, Napoleon just uses that to push through whatever laws he wants. So really the Senate becomes the only legislative body, and Napoleon controls who's in the Senate, so really it becomes a rubber stamp. Well, so the Constitution gets enacted, and Sieyès is a consul, Napoleon is first consul, so he's the most powerful, and then Ducos becomes the other consul. But Napoleon very quickly dominates this, right? And because he sees the weakness in the legislative structure, he pretty much begins to exploit that right away. And in 1802, Napoleon gets himself named first consul for life. Okay, so he no longer has a term in office and doesn't have to be elected anymore. And then in 1804, he actually declares himself emperor and gets himself crowned emperor. So he's basically brought back a monarchy. And there's all sorts of questions you could ask, like, why would people put up with this? But the fact is that after, by 1804, you're talking, it had been 15 years of chaos in France. You had the terror, you'd had all the years of warfare, you'd had all the different constitutions and the different governments, you had the exiles, you had the rebellions, you had the Vendée, etc. People were just sick of it. I mean, they were exhausted, right? And so Napoleon sort of recognized that people really just wanted things to settle down and be stable. And he gave them that, right? That under Napoleon, from basically 1799, when he became first consul, until 1812, for 13 years, they basically get some form of stability in France. They know what the government is. They know what the laws are, right? Now, they also get basically 13 more years of war, but that's outside of France. It's only in 1812 that the war actually comes to France. So, essentially then, Napoleon is in charge, and this is where Napoleon gets kind of interesting, because you remember way back at the early in the semester, Furet, in the first part of his article, he said, de Tocqueville recognized that the French Revolution was not a break in French history, it was just accelerating an existing trend. And the trend that Furet saw, that de Tocqueville saw, is that the French government was centralizing and taking power away from various aristocrats in the countryside and concentrating it in the monarchy, in the central government. And even though the French Revolution had gotten rid of the central monarchy, gotten rid of the king, it had still continued to centralize power in that central government. And we can see this with Napoleon, because by the end of the French Revolution with Napoleon, the French government is actually way more centralized than it was before the revolution. And Napoleon's a big part of this. He pushes very hard to create an efficient, centralized, rational, even scientific government of France. Okay. So what does Napoleon do when he's actually in charge? Right? Well, Napoleonic France, there's all sorts of things. I mean, it's 13 years in a pretty big country, but I'm going to point to several things that Napoleon does in his time, especially at the beginning, which in some ways, and this is kind of the interesting thing, is that some people point out that Napoleon is in some ways the sort of culmination, the end point of the revolution. This is what the revolution was leading up to, and in some ways Napoleon is the absolute opposite of where the revolution was going. Right? I mean, the whole revolution had been about liberty and equality and fraternity. Well, Napoleon gives everybody equality, but he totally gets rid of liberty. And the revolution had been about getting rid of all these old structures, the old privileges and all the old system, the ancien regime. Napoleon does that. He completes that process. He wipes out the old regime. And he brings in a modern, new, rational, systematic state. So in some sense, he's a continuation of the revolution. But, he's an emperor. He brings back the monarchy, right? So he's an interesting character in terms of how he embodies different aspects of the revolution. So what does he do? One of the first things he does is in 1801, he signs an agreement called a Concordat with the Pope in Rome, which reestablishes the Catholic Church in France. And what I mean by that, established is, I mentioned that earlier, is when a church is established, it means it has an actual official relationship with the government. So he reestablishes a relationship between the Catholic Church based in Rome and the government. So now you remember that the National Assembly had nationalized the church way back in 1790, and they had and then they had issued the civil constitution of the clergy, which forced all priests to take an oath of allegiance to the government. The Pope had excommunicated all priests who took the civil constitution of the clergy. Right, and so this has caused all, and then of course during the Terror they had tried the de-Christianization movement and had tried to basically ban the Catholic Church. Well, so Napoleon comes back and he says to the Pope, let's establish a relationship again. And so there's a lot in here for the Pope to really like. I mean, first of all, the Catholic Church is reestablished. It has an official relationship with the French government, right? Second, the Pope gives all bishops their power. They can't become bishop without the Pope investing them with their office. So this is a great thing because before that, during the Revolution at various points, bishops were named by the French government or they were elected or, all sorts of things. Now the Pope finally has that power back. In addition, the French government gives money to the Catholic Church. They support the Catholic Church. And the Pope is officially recognized as the head of the Catholic Church in France, which is a big thing, right? Because he's not French. He's not part of France. He's over in Rome. But he's recognized as the head of the Catholic Church in France. So all that is great for the Pope. But there's some other things the Pope has to give in on, and there are some ways that Napoleon really, changes the relationship. Number one is Napoleon makes it clear that religious freedom is allowed in France, meaning Jews and Protestants, and they can't be forced to be Catholic. So there's nothing in the French law is going to force anybody to practice Catholicism. Before, there had been serious legal consequences for people who wanted to be a religion other than Catholicism. Now there are no consequences. You can be whatever religion you want to be. Right? Second of all, the Catholic Church is favored. It's established. It has an official relationship with the government of France, but it's not the official religion of France. There isn't one. Okay. So the French government favors Catholicism, but it doesn't say there's an official religion, and it doesn't say you can't practice another one. Third, the National Assembly back in 1790 had confiscated all the church land and sold it off. It ain't coming back. So the church has basically lost all its lands, and the French government is not going to compensate them for that. They just got to eat that loss. Next, it's written in the Concordat that Napoleon actually nominates bishops, and the Pope recognizes them, invests them with office. So essentially, and this goes all the way back to the Middle Ages as the investiture compromise. But basically, the Pope doesn't get to nominate bishops. He gets a list from Napoleon, and he can pick off of the list and say, I'm making that guy bishop. Which gives Napoleon an enormous amount of power to shape the Catholic Church, to support the state. So this is what Napoleon really wants, is he wants the ability to make sure that the Catholic Church is always going to be backing up his government 100%. And if he can nominate bishops and give people that are loyal to him bishoprics, that's great for him. The last thing is that all priests and government church officials are still government employees. Okay? So the French government is paying them, but that also means the French government can stop paying them. Right? So this gives Napoleon a fairly large amount of power over the actual Catholic Church, functioning of the Catholic Church in France, but the Pope gets the recognition that the Pope is still the head of the Church in France, that the Catholic Church has a favored relationship with the French government, etc. And the civil constitution of the clergy is gone, all that. Elected bishops are gone, etc. So the Concordat with Rome is one of the first things. And the second big thing is the Civil Code. Between 1801 and 1804, Napoleon pulls together a group of leading legal scholars in France, and he says basically, the French legal system is an absolute mess because, before the French Revolution, we had hundreds of years of tradition, and there were all sorts of different laws, and there had been no attempt to make the laws systematic. Some laws contradicted other laws. Some laws applied over here, but not over there. Different regions of France had different laws that applied to them. There were different laws for the church, different laws for the aristocracy, different legal things applying to guilds and cities had liberties. It was this enormous patchwork that was not a system in any way, shape, or form. And every individual's legal rights were determined by the individual status of that person. Did they have a noble title? That changed things. Were they in the church? That changed things. Did they live in a city? That changed the laws that applied to them. Were they in a monastery? So each person, it was like this massive layer upon layer of different jurisdictions and things like that. And it was not at all clear what the law was, right? And then, during the Revolution, you have the National Assembly making all sorts of new laws, and then you have the Constitution of 1791, and that changes, and then you got you've got all these different legislatures through, the Legislative Assembly, the Constituent Convention, the Directory, etc., and the different constitutions. It's not clear how many laws that are passed under this constitution apply in the next constitution, etc. And so essentially Napoleon sits down and he says, with a bunch of legal scholars, he says, we need to make this rational and scientific. We got to rewrite the entire French legal code to make it consistent. It has to apply to everybody equally. And this is where he really represents the egalitarian, equality issue in the French Revolution. The law has to apply equally to everybody, and it's got to make sense. You can't have laws that contradict each other. You can't have different laws for different regions, etc. It's got to be uniform, consistent, and entirely rational. So what they write is the Civil Code is issued in 1804, and today it's called the Napoleonic Code. And this is still the legal system of France. I mean, obviously it's been modified by then. And it's even the legal system in Louisiana, because Louisiana was a French territory at this point. And it's the legal system actually for lots of former French colonies. So it's actually a good legal system in the sense that it's rational and clear and logical, right, and consistent. But it did not mean that it's a perfect legal system. In particular, everybody has equality before the law. It's great. Right? That the law applies equally to everyone. It doesn't matter, there's no aristocratic titles that mean different laws apply to you, and being in the church doesn't mean different laws apply to you. The law applies equally to everybody, rich and poor, and that's a crucial thing. At the same time, it embodies before I talked about how there were different sorts of ownership on land. You could have seigneurial rights to a piece of land even if you didn't own it, and there were leases that lasted multiple generations and things like that. It gets rid of all that, and it just comes up with a basic, simple, absolute idea of property. One person owns a piece of property, and they have absolute right to do whatever they want to it, right? And so this is a very modern conception of property law. Instead of having these different, rights and responsibilities and restrictions, etc., from tradition, etc., you just come up with a very simple property ownership is absolute. Okay. But in one place, the Civil Code, it's been changed quite a bit since then, is that, and I talked about this with gender in the French Revolution back a while ago, but the Civil Code totally made women second-class citizens. It essentially treated women as the same way that, say, our legal system treats people who are under the age of 18. Women were not allowed to sign contracts unless it was co-signed by their father or their husband or their son, whoever their legal guardian was. Women were assigned a legal male guardian. So every woman, her whole life, had a legal male guardian. It was her father when she was young, or if her father died, then an uncle or something like that, and then, or maybe an older brother, and then if she got married, it was her husband. If she didn't get married, it was usually an uncle, a cousin, a son, etc. There was always a male guardian assigned to every woman, and women could not sign contracts without the male guardians signing it along with them. And there were all sorts of ways that men were given rights over women. Fathers were legally allowed to imprison their children. Fathers were legally given the right to evict their wives and children from the home. If they just want to kick them out, they could. The wives had no legal recourse. They had no legal claim to stay in the home if the husband wanted to kick them out. And divorce law was changed also. During the Revolution, divorce had become legal and women could initiate it. Under the Napoleonic Code, divorce is still legal, but it's restricted. First of all, the only reasons for divorce, there could be mutual consent for divorce if they both agree they want to get divorced, but even then they had to get their parents' permission to do it. But the only reasons for divorce beyond that were adultery. So, I mean, a contested divorce where one person wants a divorce and the other one doesn't. The grounds for that could be adultery, abuse, or a criminal conviction. So if a husband was convicted of a crime, the wife could divorce him. If it could be proven that the husband was beating his wife, she could get a divorce. The adultery one is kind of interesting. Anytime the woman is shown to be sexually show sexual infidelity to her husband, the husband has the legal right to divorce her. But for a wife to divorce a husband for adultery, it's different. The wife has to not only prove that adultery is happening, but has to prove that the husband has brought the mistress to live in the wife's home. If the husband has a mistress who lives somewhere else, that's not grounds for divorce. Okay? So that's the civil constitution of the civil code, the Napoleonic Code. Those are the two big legal things that were the big sort of legislative rules that Napoleon passed. But there were a number of other things he did. One interesting aspect of Napoleon's rule was that he consistently saw himself as the representative of the general will, the will of the people. This is the Rousseauian idea. This is what Furet is talking about, in that Napoleon saw himself as being emperor because of he was chosen by the people of France, although that's not the case. And he saw himself acting on behalf of the people of France. Right? He saw himself representing the people of France. And so periodically, Napoleon would hold plebiscites. And a plebiscite is a vote where you're not voting for a candidate, you're voting on an issue. And we have various names for them in the United States, but most states have some sort of allowance that you can go when you go to vote, you might vote for governor or state representatives or whatever, but then at the bottom there might be an issue where you say, do you want to, legalize gay marriage or, prevent property taxes from rising or whatever. There's all sorts of things. And so you're voting yes or no on a law. Well, Napoleon held plebiscites, and at various points he would hold plebiscites as a way of sort of showing that he represented the will of the people of France. Now, I want to make it clear, Napoleon, when he had his plebiscites, when you went to vote on them, you had to write your name and then write the way you voted, which means everyone could see the way you voted. And I'll talk about the secret police and Fouché in a minute, but that has serious consequences. So the voting was essentially rigged. Anybody who wanted to vote against what Napoleon wanted was putting their lives on the line because they had to stand up and say, yes, I'm voting for this, and then they were sitting ducks for Napoleon's government to come after them. So whenever Napoleon had a plebiscite, he was sure he was going to win, and usually he got 99% of the vote. But the fact that he even had plebiscites was interesting because it implied that he really thought of himself as needing popular approval and needing to manufacture this appearance that everybody loved him, right, in order to keep power. And it is pretty clear that he saw this as a way of using the Rousseauian idea of the general will to sort of say, yeah, I represent the general will. And no individual out in France could really disagree with him because the only measure they had of what people approved of was the vote, and he always got 99% of the vote. So anybody who disagreed with Napoleon was sort of left going, well, geez, 99% of the other people agree with him, And so it really did create the appearance that he was a legitimate government that represented the will of the people of France. Another thing I want to talk about, Napoleon created a really efficient, centralized government. He created what we would call a professional bureaucracy, where highly trained people were put in government positions based on expertise at tax law or economics or whatever, engineering, etc. And to get a job, you had to prove that you were qualified for it. So this was a government that was, by and large, not that corrupt, right? People actually got jobs because they were qualified for it. And it was a government that was highly centralized and efficient. They made sure that when they wanted something to happen, it happened, and it happened efficiently, and it happened smoothly, and it was clear to everybody what was going on. And the law was clear, and procedures were clear, and processes were clear, and it was very centralized. It was a really efficient government. It was a very modern government. And this is part of what Furet is talking about, echoing de Tocqueville, is that coming out of the going into the revolution, France had this archaic government that had all these different levels of bureaucracy and different jurisdictions and different regions and different sets of laws and different, the tax system was a complete mess and the court system was a complete mess, and they had all these extra people working for the government because they had sold offices and then they had to hire other people to do the work. And they come out of the revolution at the other end with a highly streamlined and efficient bureaucracy where everybody is there to actually do a particular job and they're qualified to do it, and you have a clear legal system and it applies uniformly to everybody. This is a modern production, right? The French Revolution essentially got rid of a whole bunch of extra dross and clutter in the French government and came out a lean, mean, efficient government. One key part of this centralized efficiency is an education system. Napoleon centralized the education system. Now, before this, France had multiple education systems. Lots of people, middle class and upper class people, hired private tutors to teach their children. The Jesuits ran lots of schools before the French Revolution. And other Catholic religious orders ran schools. And then some cities, ran schools also. And then the convents often took in young girls, and they'd live in the convent in their teenage years and go to school at the convent, being taught by the nuns. But Napoleon basically, he says, first of all, he says, I don't care about women's education, so there is no education system for women. They still get educated by the nuns in the convents, although there aren't convents. They reestablished them. But for the elementary level, Napoleon's like, well, I'm not that interested. But at the high school level, he starts to found a national education system at the high school level that is systematic, it's scientific, it's based on Enlightenment principles, it teaches things like engineering and mathematics and stuff like that. It's not religious education. And then he establishes a series of colleges and universities that also train people, and a lot of this, he's really focused on training effective people. He's focused on training, geologists and engineers and sociologists and government officials. And so there are technical schools to teach specific skills. There are general, colleges and universities to teach, political science, or not politics, but political science in the sense of understanding how government administration works. And so it's really sort of a modern education system. Now, it steers clear of anything that would give people any ideas about political power, radical political theories or whatever. So it steers clear of revolutionary ideology and anything like that, and it steers clear of philosophy. But it does provide a training system, and it's a standardized curriculum. So if you go to if you study engineering in northern France and you study engineering in southern France, you're getting the same curriculum, right? And today it's even argued that you could in Paris, you could walk into the Ministry of Education in Paris and say, what are third graders learning today? And they could actually tell you what third graders in all of France are studying that day, because it's a standardized curriculum for the whole nation. Napoleon was a really big part of this. Okay. Now, a couple interesting things about the education system is, first, it by and large, given that there wasn't an elementary education system, it's really middle-class people and upper-class people who can afford to tutor their children or pay for private schools up until the high school, lycée level, right? And so the education system is largely there to finish off the educations of the elites, the wealthy and the middle class. but it still had some spots reserved for poor kids, and so it still took a few really bright kids from the lower classes and gave them a path to middle class status or even upper class status, and maybe, you know, an important position in the government through the education system. So it generally favored keeping the wealthy in power. You know, it just provided education for the wealthy and kept them, you know, allowed them to perpetuate their position generation after generation. But it did allow just a few trickle ups from the lower classes. So, and that's just enough to make people in the lower classes think, well, you know, the system works. You know, I see that guy, he was like me and he made it. So, you know, if I can't get into the education system, I'm just not smart enough, because people like me can get in there. See, that guy did it. So it provides a certain amount of cover. If you give just a few poor kids a chance, it makes it look like the whole education system is not stacked against poor kids. Right? Finally, I want to talk about the police state. Because Napoleon very definitely created a police state. And in particular, this guy, Fouché, created the police state. Now, I mean, Fouché was an amazing story. You know, as I mentioned before, he was a priest. He was studying in seminary when the revolution starts. Then he leaves the priesthood and he goes to become a revolutionary. He gets into the National Assembly. He becomes like a totally diehard radical who is a Republican, and then he becomes a representative of mission, and then he's a terrorist. He's running around killing people with the mitraillades, you know, blasting people with cannons in Lyon and burning the city down. And then he's trying to de-Christianize the country and attack the Catholic Church and destroy Catholicism and Christianity in general, and replace it with a cult of reason. And then he's arrested at the end of the terror, and when Robespierre is killed, Fouché is in jail, right? And he's in jail for a while, and he's actually going to be executed anyway in Thermidor. But then there's these blanket amnesties, and he gets released. So like he was on death row basically, and he gets released, and then he gets back into politics. He gets back into the legislature, and the government rather, and he becomes the Minister of Police under the Directory. He gets pulled out of that position, and then he joins the plotters, and now he winds up as Napoleon's Minister of Police, right? And so he becomes the Minister of Police for the Napoleonic Empire, and he's the Minister of Police for virtually the entire empire. The entire time Napoleon is in power, Fouché is his Minister of Police. And Fouché turns out to be really nasty, but also really brilliant at being a Minister of Police, right? He sets up this idea of keeping an enormous file system where they would collect information on just about anybody who might possibly be a threat to the government. And they have spies. He has a network of spies all over the whole country keeping track of rumors about anybody and all sorts of things like that, making regular reports on what so-and-so is doing and thinking, etc. So he's got this massive surveillance system. And it's really state-of-the-art, and it's very modern, and nobody had seen anything like it before. It's also probable that Fouché had some dirt on Napoleon himself, because Napoleon seemed to be really tolerant of Fouché. And we'll actually see, I'll just point to it later. After Napoleon falls, they bring back Louis XVIII. Louis XVI's younger brother comes back as Louis XVIII. And he hires Fouché as the Minister of Police. Fouché had voted to execute Louis XVI. Fouché had killed how many aristocrats? And Louis XVIII, Mr. Traditional Monarchy, comes in and hires Fouché again. Fouché had dirt on people, okay? So at any rate, Fouché keeps this elaborate spy network going, and he's got secret prisons, and he's arresting people and throwing them in prison for political statements and things like that. You say anything too critical of Napoleon, and Fouché's going to swoop in and arrest you. And then he's got this elaborate censorship process for censoring any newspapers or books that say anything he doesn't like about Napoleon. And so it becomes an elaborate process of controlling information, and I mean both in the positive sense that he's gathering information on people all the time, but he's also controlling the dissemination of information. People can't get information. So Fouché becomes the center of this sort of network of controlling people and information all across France, and it really stabilizes the government. But people are living under the first version of sort of a first trial run of the sorts of totalitarian dictatorships that would show up later with Stalinist Russia and et cetera. Fidel Castro's Cuba, places that have a secret police, et cetera. Mussolini's Italy. Fouché is the forerunner of all those, right? In addition, the French state had set up a system where it had really significant control over the working class. And the way they did that was kind of nefarious, but first of all, they outlawed labor unions. So the workers can't form labor unions, that's illegal. But then the Napoleonic government sets up a system that's called the livret system. Now, a livret is just a booklet, but essentially, it's a booklet, it's an official book, it's sort of like a passport almost, and in it is your work history. And essentially what happens is that you cannot get hired for a job without a livret, and you have to hand your livret over to your boss. And then when you leave the job, the boss writes in there how you left your job and then hands it back to you. But if your boss is mad at you when you quit, he doesn't have to give your livret back. And if that's the case, you cannot legally get another job. So your boss has the power to say you will never get another job again. That gives enormous power to the boss, right? And so the livret system also allows the Napoleonic government to know where people are, and they can even move people around. They can even say that, if they have a bunch of unemployed workers in one city and they need workers in another city, they can simply round up a bunch of workers in one city, take their livrets away and say, you want your livret? Go to Lyon, it's down there, right? And so they actually move workers around to places where they need jobs, they need workers, by just simply controlling the livret system. So this gives the government enormous amounts of control over the sans-culottes. And you can sort of see, with this police state, with the livret system, you can see why the Marxists go, well, the end result of the revolution was the middle class. They wiped out the aristocracy, they wiped out the old system, and they seized control. But they push the working class, the sans-culottes, back out of power. They push them out of the political process. They get them to shut up, and they set up this livret system, which totally favors employers, middle class factory owners, business owners, and totally puts the working class at a big disadvantage and allows the middle class to exploit them. So the Marxists basically say, yeah, this is what happens in the French Revolution. It's about class conflict. And this police state, the livret system, this is all really part of class conflict where the middle class is solidifying, the bourgeoisie, solidifying its control of the country by enforcing the sort of oppressive police state on the working classes. Overall, it's clear that Napoleon's empire favored the middle classes, right? I mean, he does not bring back all the old aristocratic titles, the old dukes and counts and viscounts, etc. The Napoleonic Code wipes out all of the old privileges for the aristocracy, privileges for the church, etc. And Napoleon does institute a new sort of honorific title system, but it's just honorific, okay? Meaning it's just a cool title he gives to people. It doesn't have any legal ramifications. And so he wipes out all the old advantages that the aristocracy had. And he makes everybody equal. But then, things like the livret system allow employers to have enormous power over their workers. Things like the education system allow the middle class and the upper classes, the wealthy elites, to give their kids a great education and put their kids in positions of power without having it seem like it's privilege, right? Because officially the education system is based on merit, your intelligence, your abilities, and there's just enough poor kids who get into the system to sort of make that true. And so what the Napoleonic system does, and the bourgeoisie loves business-like efficiency, and Napoleon delivers on that. The government becomes really efficient and streamlined, and the bureaucracy is clear. And so the Napoleonic system is really sort of perfect for the urban upper middle class elites, the small business owners, the big business owners, the the financiers, the doctors, the lawyers, etc. They thrive under the Napoleonic system, right? And so the Marxists, this is where the Marxists are saying, well, you look at what happens. Beginning of the French Revolution, the bourgeoisie and the working class and the peasants all rise up and they overthrow aristocratic privileges, but then they start fighting with each other, and you can see all the conflict between the middle class representatives in the convention and the Santa Claus in the street outside, and ultimately the middle class wins by putting Napoleon in charge and instituting a system that looks like everybody's equal, but in reality it favors the upper middle classes and over everybody else, and it puts the working class in a sort of a police state under the Libre system. So anyway, this is the Napoleonic government, and tomorrow we'll see how it all falls apart.